In this amazing game, Tigran Petrosian goes against type. We know that normally he's known for playing enclosed positions and anticipating his opponent's threats. Well, in this game, he turns the tables on the legendary Vasily Smyslov, a world champion himself, and he has a point in this game, Petrosian does, where he calculates 26 moves deep. By my calculation, it could have even been more, of course. This is really an amazing and special game between two future world champions. I hope you enjoy it. Petrosian versus Smyslov. This was played in 1951 in Moscow. Petrosian has white, Smyslov has black. Petrosian begins with d4, d5, c4, and Smyslov plays dc4, the Queen's Gambit accepted. And usually black will try to play either c5 or e5 to liquidate white's advantage in the center and get an equal position. Knight to f3 is played to control the e5 square, knight to f6, and knight to c3. Petrosian, as you can see, is just developing his pieces and not making any attempt yet to grab the pawn on c4. But now Smyslov plays c6, and this is a serious move, because now he is threatening to play b5 and defend this pawn on c4, and Petrosian, perhaps surprisingly to some, lets him do it. He goes ahead and plays e4. The move a4 would be how you would try to recapture that pawn, stop b5, advance, and then take with the bishop. But he plays e4, a gambit where he's going to let Smyslov have that pawn. In exchange, however, Petrosian gets a nice full pawn center that he can use to attack his opponent. b5 is played, keeping that pawn at c4. e5 immediately grabbing space in the center. Smyslov moves his knight to the nice d5 square. One thing that Petrosian has gained space, but he's weakened his light squares in the center a little bit. So Smyslov puts his knight right there on that square. And now a4, he does begin to attack the queenside pawn chain. And the maneuver you're about to see is very common, even in today's chess. The threat, of course, is for him to just take twice on b5, once with the pawn and then with the knight. Smyslov plays e6 with the possibility of bishop to b4, pinning that knight. So Petrosian takes the pawn. So what happens is Smyslov plays this intermediate move. He takes the knight at c3 first, right? So if he takes the pawn, he would just lose the pawn. And so he takes the knight at c3 first, and then after pawn takes knight, then he can retake on b5, which he does, and Smyslov keeps his extra pawn, and not only does he have an extra pawn, he has a passer on the a-file. So Petrosian has given up quite a bit to play for this space advantage and this dynamic compensation. Knight to g5. This knight is very aggressively posted. Maybe it could be supported by a pawn at h4. Also, it could pivot to e4 and put some pressure on black's dark squares as well. Smyslov plays bishop to b7. A beautiful square for this bishop. You see it goes down the entire diagonal. Makes it very hard for Petrosian to develop his king's bishop. So a very nicely placed piece. In fact, if black can consolidate, white would just be lost, which means Petrosian has to put maximum pressure on Smyslov, or he's just going to get squeezed. Petrosian's the one who usually does the squeezing. Well, he begins with an immediate threat. Queen to h5, threatening queen takes f7, checkmate. Serious threat. So Smyslov plays g6, kicking the queen back. The queen goes to g4, and you can see there's some pressure on e6. Maybe there's a sacrifice, maybe not, but black has to constantly be aware of white sacrificing further material around e6 and f7. Bishop to e7 is played by Smyslov, putting pressure on the knight at g5. Bishop to e2, just getting that last piece developed. Now that the queen is defending g2, he doesn't have to worry about the bishop at b7 taking the pawn. Knight to d7, it would be a big mistake to play bishop takes g5. Computers don't think it's so bad, but for a human, it's awful. These light squares, these dark squares, excuse me, are in terrible shape. And black does not have his dark squared bishop. White does have his. So knight to d7 makes more sense. h4, Petrosian not only supports the knight, but he could also go ahead and play h5 and threaten to open up that h-file and cause a lot of trouble with the black's kingside pawn structure. So Smyslov responds with h5, and Petrosian plays queen to g3. Now, Smyslov has this pawn structure on the king side, but it is still sensitive to potential sacrifices. Now, in fairness, Smyslov with black does still have a bit of an advantage here. because of his extra pawn and this passed a pawn, which has not started moving yet. But he's under pressure every single move. Knight to b6 is played by Smyslov. Not only does that protect the c4 pawn if he later advances the b pawn, but also that knight can also land on d5, taking advantage of that weak light square. Petrosian goes ahead and castles, and now Smyslov plays a5, beginning the march of those queenside pawns. So the pressure still remains on white to prove something here. So he plays d5, and he has to find counterplay somewhere. And so he plays d5, basically opening up the potential lines for the bishop to get into the position. If bishop takes d5, rook to d1, that's another thing. It opens up the d file and pins the bishop. Again, it's good to have the pawn, but after queen c7, bishop e3, you can see white does have some activity for his pawn, or two pawns in that case. Instead, Smyslov goes ahead and takes with the knight on d5. Rook to d1, as we just saw. The rook is on the open d file. It's blocked by the knight, but there's still an open file. There are no pawns on it. Queen to c7 is played. Smyslov moves out of the aim of that rook. And now knight to e4, putting pressure on these dark squares. d6 or f6. It could come in, deliver check. And you see, black has a little problem with this king. You know, there's no comfortable place for the king. The king side is very dangerous. The center is dangerous. Queen side is probably best, but all of his pawns have been advanced, so there's risk no matter where he puts his king. He goes ahead and castles long. It is possible to have played king to f8 here, but maybe he felt that was too risky. So he ends up castling long, and here Petrosian makes a very strong move. He plays the move bishop to g5, offering the exchange of dark squared bishops. He sees that the dark squares in black's position are quite weak, so he wants to exchange off the dark squared bishops so he can exploit those squares even further, particularly this nice square on d6. So bishop takes g5, queen takes g5, and now the knight has access to the d6 square. a4 is played by Smyslov. Not only does that advance the pawn, but it makes it so that the rook at a1 is sort of biting on granite. There's no activity for it down the a file anymore. Petrosian plays queen to g3. He knows that when he puts the knight into d6, Smyslov is going to have to give up that rook for that knight. And when that happens, he doesn't want Smyslov to get a knight and a pawn. He has the queen where the queen will defend the pawn, so recovering that pawn will be harder for black. So that's why the queen goes to g3 to help support that square d6. A bishop to c6, knight to d6 check. Rook takes d6, e d6, queen d7. And black will regain the pawn, but he's going to have to move the rook over and lose a tempo. But Smyslov lashes out a little bit here. He decides to put pressure on Petrosian, and he plays the move f5. An interesting decision. Obviously, if he takes en passant, the queens would be exchanged. But he also leaves this g-pawn hanging. Perhaps he was thinking if white takes the g-pawn, he can move a rook over to the g-file and attack white's king. That might be his thought. If pawn takes pawn en passant, then I have queen g3, fg3, rook hf8, and black is just winning. He has the material, and the pawn at f6 is in trouble, so that would be bad news. So Petrosian instead goes ahead and jumps into d6, knight to d6 check, and Smyslov, again, cannot withstand that knight. He has to get it off of the board, so he takes it with the rook, e d6, and here queen to c6 was an interesting idea, setting up discoveries against g2, but after bishop f3, contesting that diagonal, rook to d8, queen takes g6, and now there's no way for a rook to get to the g-file to attack the king. White looks like he's better there. So instead, Smyslov makes an interesting decision. He plays the move f4, counterattacking the queen. The tension is building. Both queens are under attack by a pawn. If Petrosian were to take Smyslov's queen at c7, that their fg3, bishop f3, king takes c7, it's a similar situation where black is really just winning here. Even though he's down in exchange, he's up 3 pawns. I mean, this pawn will, I guess, fall pretty soon. But his pieces are well placed. He's got these passed pawns over here. one passed pawn and a potential second passed pawn on the queen side, and that would be bad news. So Petrosian can't really just exchange queens, so he goes ahead and takes on g6. Queen takes d6, and bishop to f3. He needs to contest this long diagonal that Smyslov has had control of for a long time. So he plays bishop to f3, challenging the dark squared bishop. Now bishop to c6. Had some potential defense to b5, but more importantly, when white attacks e6, he's going to want to move his rook over to e8 to defend it, and the queen controls that square, so the bishop at c6 would defend a rook on that square. So rook to e1, attacking the e6 pawn twice, and now rook to e8 is played, defending the pawn. One strong idea was rook a to d1, centralizing the rooks, but Petrosian chooses a more forcing continuation. He goes ahead and takes the knight on d5. An interesting move. If black could just retake with the bishop, then he would probably just be better. The problem is if he takes with the bishop, then queen takes rook check. The rook would lose its defender. And of course, you can't take with the pawn because then the queen would fall. So he really has to take with the queen. He's aiming at the g2 pawn, although that is defended by the queen at g6 for the moment. But rook a to d1 hits the queen, and the queen goes to f5. Smyslov tries to find some relief by exchanging queens, hoping that his pawns on the queen side will save him. And Petrosian, after looking at the position, says, I think I can play this endgame and be okay. So he goes ahead and takes the queens off of the board. Rook to e8 check, bishop takes e8. So we have a bishop versus a rook, a bishop and two pawns versus a rook, and he has this passed a pawn, which is only 3 squares away from the queening square. Petrosian's next move is one of those deep strategic moves that's very important. He plays the move f3. And what he's doing, he's making sure these kingside pawns are fixed. As we see this endgame progress, we'll see that Smyslov really wishes this pawn at f5 were not there. He would love for that pawn to be gone and for his bishop to be on g6. But now he can do nothing about it. This pawn is going to be there pretty much forever, reducing the mobility of that bishop. King to c7, the king's centralized, get into position, rushing into the battle area. We see Smyslov coming forward to support his queenside pawns. Now rook to b1, stopping b4, excuse me, from being played. If that happened, black could create 2 passed pawns, one on a4 and one on c4, and Petrosian does not want that to happen. a3, king to d2. So is Petrosian going to get there in time? Now b4 is played. It would be a mistake to take with the rook, of course, because boom, a2, and that would do it. I think if he tried to play a move like this, he could just play there, and if he checks from behind, he can just block it. I think that's how that would work. So he has to take with the pawn, and now he bypasses the pawn. And again, we see how much Smyslov would love to have a bishop on g6 aiming down here, and but the pawn at f5 completely prevents it. King to c3, a2, rook to a1, king to a3. So what's going to happen here? Can black make further progress? It is at this point that Petrosian makes a critical decision based on a very long calculation. I've just counted it out myself, and I've come to 26 moves. Maybe there's a different number. I just did that in my head when I counted out this position. Petrosian sacrifices his rook. So he's making a full commitment. If his calculation is wrong, he's going to lose. So he has to calculate accurately. So he decides to sacrifice his rook in this endgame. And let's watch how this progresses, this deep calculation. He goes ahead and takes the pawn at c4, knowing what's going to happen next. King to b2, hitting the rook when the rook moves. Smyslov queens. The rook has to give himself up for the queen. King takes rook. So this is the position Petrosian had to have in his mind when he decided to sacrifice the rook. He has to say that my king position plus this pawn are more important than black being up a bishop. Let's see if that, in fact, is the case. See if he calculated accurately. He plays b5. If bishop takes b5 check, this endgame is easily won for white. He just comes over and takes the pawns, and there's nothing to be done to stop them from advancing. So Smyslov plays bishop to d7. Maybe he'll try to defend from the c8 square. b6, bishop to c8. Bishop c6 really amounts to the same thing. Now king to d4. What Petrosian is going to do is going to leave this pawn on b6 so that this bishop gets stuck and can't move forward. King b2, king e5, coming in to munch these kingside pawns. King c3, king takes f4, king d4, king g5. Now, if he gets this h-pawn, black is going to have to deal with two passed pawns, and he obviously is going to get that h-pawn. King e5, king takes h5. So Petrosian certainly calculated this far into the game and came to the conclusion that black cannot stop both the b and the h pawns. King f6 was played by Smyslov, then g4, advancing on the king side, bishop to b7, and king to h6. And in this position, Smyslov resigned. But Petrosian would have had to have calculated further than this, all the way back when he sacrificed the rook. So let's go through a few more moves to see what this endgame might look like. After bishop takes pawn, g5 check, king to f7. You can see how he would advance these pawns on the king side. King g5, bishop to e4. And by the way, he's got to worry about this pawn running away, so he has to take time out to take that pawn. Bishop g2, again, Smyslov has to continue to control this b7 square. But after king g5, bishop e4, h6, you can see these pawns are a little too fast. Bishop d5, king f6. And now he's coming in to this square with the threat of advancing twice. So Smyslov would try to keep his king out, but then Petrosian could promote to a queen, king takes queen, then king to f8, and bishop d5, and he can't stop the pawns from advancing on both squares. So after b7, and again, this is post-game analysis, this did not happen in the game, he would have to take the pawn, then g7 check, king h7, and he would promote to a queen. A truly phenomenal calculation, and an interesting attacking and sacrificial game from Petrosian against a world-class player in Vasily Smyslov. I hope you enjoyed the game. See you again soon at Chess Talk. Goodbye.